thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. And I feel that there's a lot of people here that I should thank, more than I can possibly have time for or remember. But I just want to first off thank the Friends of the Missouri State Archives, not only for inviting me here to address this gathering. I'm aware of the caliber of scholars and writers who've been called in to give this address on other occasions, and I'm deeply honored to be in their company.
Use the mic, please.
I thought it was on.
Yeah.
It is on. We need it more on.
Okay. How do you increase the volume? How's about I just speak? Maybe I can speak louder.
If you clip it on with a mic.
Okay, there we go. How about that? All right. Can you all hear me now? Excellent. So I'm very grateful to have been honored to be invited to address you all this evening. And also I wanted to mention that the Friends of the Missouri State Archives was directly responsible for helping me complete this project back when it was a PhD dissertation. They were gracious enough to award me the Foley Fellowship, which helped pay for the research costs, the travel costs, and other things that allowed me to complete that. So thank you so much for that. Also, there's somebody else a couple of other people that I should recognize. Lynn Morrow, who used to run the local records program here at the Missouri State Archives and provided me with assistance above and beyond the call of duty in writing and researching this project. And also Mr. Dugan in the back there, Director of the Archives. Thank you both for all of your help. Make sure that this is on. There we go. So I want to begin by basically explaining how this presentation is going to proceed, how it's going to unfold. For this evening, I chose a presentation that will address some of the major questions that are often asked to me when people find out that I wrote a book on the Bald Knobbers. Some of the major questions that people ask me about this group and about my research on them. So I sort of go through each of these in turn, but of course, by the end of the presentation, there will be plenty of time for you all to ask me your own questions as well. One of the most common questions that people have asked me ever since I began working on this project around 7 years ago is, who were the Bald Knobbers? And also, how did they get that funny name? Well, as you may know, particularly those of you who may have peeked inside of my book at some point over the last few months, the Bald Knobbers were a vigilante organization founded in the town of Forsyth in Taney County, Missouri, sometime in late 1884 or early 1885. Tradition has it that the founding members of the group consisted of a committee of 13 prominent citizens of Taney County, including 4 of the ringleaders were Nat Kinney, Alonzo Prather, James K. Polk McAfee, and Charles Broom, and several others. I'll just go ahead and give you the other members. They included Barton Y. Everett. By the way, they called him Yell Everett because he had a habit of speaking very, very loudly. James B. Rice, Thomas Phillips, James R. Van Zandt, one of the more interesting characters in my book, a Mexican and Civil War veteran. Pat Fickle, J.J. Brown, major attorney from Taney County during this period. Also held several local elective offices. Galba Branson, a one-time sheriff of Taney County until he got shot. James A. DeLong, Kinney's stepson, and Benjamin Price. So those are the ringleaders. And they met, again, sometime late 1884, early 1885, at a general store previously owned by a fellow named James Everett. Everett was not there for the meeting because he had been shot a couple of months before. And that also contributes to why the group got founded, but more on that in a bit. The group originally called itself simply the Committee for Law and Order, one of those simple generic names that a lot of these types of organizations went by back at that time. But they got their more colorful nickname, and the name that we've come to know them by in the history books, from the site of their first large-scale public meeting. It took place on top of a high, treeless hill called Snap's Bald, which, by the way, was named after Harrison Snap, one of the first settlers in the county. At this time, there were a lot of these treeless hilltops in the area, not so much now. Most of them have grown over with trees, but the locals typically refer to them as balds, or sometimes they even called them bald knobs. And so when the critics of the new group saw where the vigilantes were meeting, it was a natural thing to refer to them as bald knobbers. And like a lot of pejorative nicknames over the years, it stuck. It was colorful, it was memorable, and eventually the group itself adopted it as their nickname. Now, I mentioned that the Bald Knobbers were a vigilante organization. Most of you probably have, there we go, okay. Most of you probably have some vague sense of what the term vigilante means, particularly if you've watched Batman movie or any of the Marvel's Avengers franchise. But for the purposes of clarity, I think a brief definition is in order. As I intend to use it, the term vigilante can be defined in two ways. One, it can be defined as a person who takes or who advocates the taking of law enforcement into one's own hands without having any legal authorization or right to do so. And the other way to define a vigilante would be simply a member of a vigilance committee, a member of some type of organization dedicated to that purpose, taking the law into one's own hands. So the definition of vigilantism, therefore, or another way of saying it would be vigilante justice, those terms mean more or less the same thing, is the actions of a person, or more often a group of people, because most vigilantes do act in concert with others, who take it upon themselves to enforce the law and or their own idea of social morality or social order in their community, usually without any legal sanction or authority to do so. Now, although we Americans like to think of ourselves as a generally peaceful and law-abiding people, vigilantes and vigilante groups are actually incredibly common throughout American history. Not only that, but the practice of vigilante justice is actually older than the United States itself. It goes all the way back to the late colonial period, to North and South Carolina, the North and South Carolina regulators. These were two roughly contemporaneous groups in North and South Carolina. Both of them operated in the mid-1760s, and both claimed the dubious distinction of being the first vigilante-style groups in American history. Incidentally, the second of these movements, the North Carolina regulators, actually precipitated a popular uprising against the authority of the colonial government of North Carolina's then royal governor, a fellow by the name of William Tryon, and that uprising had to be put down with armed force at a small battle called the Battle of Alamance in May of 1771, which some North Carolina historians like to refer to as the first battle of the American Revolution. I don't really buy that, but that it is sometimes referred to as that. Vigilantism also played a role in the American Revolution itself. During the Revolutionary War, various patriot militia groups used vigilante tactics like whipping, hanging, tarring, and feathering to either drive out or silence opposition from the Tory or Loyalist population, the people who were still loyal to King George, in their midst. As a matter of fact, there's a term that is often associated with vigilante justice. I'm sure you've all heard of the term lynching, right? That comes from either Charles or William Lynch. These were two patriot militia officers, both of them operating in Virginia, and both of them used vigilante tactics, whipping, intimidation, destruction of property, sometimes even hanging, to crush opposition from local Tories to the revolution. As the American frontier moved westward, vigilantism and vigilante groups moved along with it. For example, vigilantes. There we go. Vigilantes played a big role in the early settlement and development of California during the famed California Gold Rush of 1849. Some of you are probably aware that that's where the name of the professional football team comes from, the 49ers. During the year 48 to 49, around 80 to 100,000 young, mostly poor prospectors from the eastern United States flocked to the gold fields of California, and of course they were looking to strike it rich. Unfortunately, the ordinary institutions of law enforcement, like courts and sheriffs and lawyers, lagged far behind them. So initially they had to compensate for the lack of regular law enforcement institutions by setting up impromptu popular tribunals to punish crimes committed in the mining camps. These are just self-appointed tribunals which have the authority by popular assent to banish or fine or even hang lawbreakers in the mining camps. By the way, one of the first great books ever written about vigilante justice by a fellow named Bancroft is titled Popular Tribunals. It's over 100 years old now, but it's still a great read. Later on, in the bustling port city of San Francisco, No, that's that. I promise I'm pressing the one to go forward. There we go. All right. This is sort of connected with the gold rush. Of course, a lot of your settlers are coming to California. Some of them go across the Rockies, but a lot of them go around South America by steamship and land in various port cities along the California coast, and one of the major destinations was San Francisco. So San Francisco became a boom town connected with the California gold rush. It grew exponentially during the first decade after the gold rush, and of course, with the swelling population, there came a criminal element, including, ironically enough, a large number of criminals from Australia. They refer to them as the Sydney Ducks, because they're, can cross the water, amphibious creatures. And as a result, two huge vigilante groups, both of them calling themselves the Committee of Vigilance, were formed. The first one was formed in 1851. The second one was formed in 1856 to deal with the city's crime problem. And the latter of these organizations was rumored to number somewhere around 6,000 individuals, which would have made it easily the largest vigilante group in U.S. history prior to the 20th century. After the Civil War, in the years after the Civil War, vigilante justice became, if anything, even more common than it had been before. In some cases, vigilante groups popped up when large numbers of people moved into frontier areas where regular law enforcement institutions had not taken firm root. For example, in the 1860s, in Montana's Alder Gulch region, it saw a huge mining boom stemming from the discovery of gold in the early 1860s there. And as waves of prospectors poured in, gangs of outlaws also came to prey on the gold miners. So the residents of the towns of Virginia City and Nevada City formed a vigilance committee to purge the area of outlaws. It was a relatively small vigilance committee compared to, say, the Bald Knobbers, but it was incredibly bloody. They killed around 30 people. In other cases, vigilantism grew out of the violence and the unrest left over from the Civil War. Some of the best examples of this come from right here in Missouri, where vicious guerrilla fighting ravaged the state during the war years and left behind thousands of violent, angry young men who had been trained in the use of force to settle their problems. People like the Younger brothers and the James brothers and so on. And of course, then we would see the emergence of vigilance committees to take care of these type of outlaws. For example, in the 1860s, a fellow by the name of David McKee, no, that's too far. There we go. In the 1860s, a fellow named David McKee, a former Union Army officer, founded a group called the Anti-Horse Thief Association, or AHTA. And as the name implies, their main purpose was to crack down on horse thievery, particularly horse thieves flitting across state lines into, from or into Iowa or from or into Illinois. So this group was dedicated to stamping out gangs of horse thieves that plagued that part of the state. In later years, the AHTA spread to numerous other states in the Midwest and the West, particularly in the early 20th century. By 1916, it had an estimated 40,000 members in at least 9 different states. In Greene County, the Greene County regulators, Greene County is where Springfield is, my hometown. The Greene County regulators were formed in 1866 in response to a rash of robberies, horse theft, and murder in that area. They were only active for a couple of months, but they hung 3 suspected criminals and shot a 4th. From 1866 to 1867, a similar organization operated in Vernon County. They called themselves the Marmaton League. Not much known about them except that they broke up a, quote, band of supposed horse thieves and desperados operating in the area, and that they shot one of the outlaws in the process and expelled a large number of people from the county who were suspected of being in league with the criminal element. And then in 1875, a group called the Stone County Sons of Honor attempted to enforce their own idea of, next slide please, their own idea of law and order. There we go. In the process, it created so many problems for the legitimate local government in Stone County that Missouri's governor, who at the time was Charles Hardin, sent his adjutant general, who was none other than the famous painter and artist George Caleb Bingham, sent him down to the county to mediate an end to the strike, which in a way would foreshadow something that would happen later on in the 1880s with the Bald Knobbers, but more on that in a bit. So that's the history of, that's a brief overview, I should say, of the history of vigilantism in Missouri. I haven't covered everything, but up until the time of the Bald Knobbers. So of course that brings us then, finally, at long last, to the Bald Knobbers. There we go. Aside from their origin and their funny name, another common question which I encounter when discussing the Bald Knobbers concerns their motives. Put it simply, what exactly did the Bald Knobbers want that motivated them to become vigilantes? Well, the first thing you need to keep in mind when answering this question is that when we speak about the Bald Knobbers, we are in fact talking about two very different groups. The Taney County Bald Knobbers, the original Bald Knobber organization, and then a group that was founded shortly thereafter in Christian County and another one in Douglas County, the Christian and Douglas County Bald Knobbers. And in my book I make sharp distinctions between these two groups of Bald Knobbers. They shared some things in common, but they had very different motives for organizing. The Taney County Bald Knobbers had essentially three major motives for organizing. The first motive was, I'll put it this way, it was the widespread perception that their community had become riddled with crime and violence. This perception was probably worse than the reality. For example, in my book I examine a widely quoted claim that in Taney County somewhere between 30 and 40 murders occurred over a 20-year period between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the Bald Knobbers, a claim that I conclude for various reasons was probably exaggerated. Nevertheless, this perception was reinforced by several notorious crimes that occurred in Taney County in the years just prior to the Bald Knobber movement, so the early 1880s. These included the murder of James Everett, the owner of that general store in Forsyth, where the Bald Knobbers were organized. He was killed by Al Layton in 1883. The murder of Amos Ring by his son-in-law, Newton Harrell, in 1884. The murder of John Taylor by George Lane, also in 1884. In 1885, the murder of an infant boy, the son of a fellow named Lemuel Matthews, by bushwhackers who were attempting to kill the father and ended up shooting the son instead. And lastly, they included the attempted murders of storekeeper John T. Dickinson and his wife by the outlaws Frank and Tubal Taylor in 1885. So you have a rash of violent crimes that occur right around the early 1880s that reinforce this widespread perception that crime and violence have got completely out of control in our neighborhood, and we need to do something about this. The second motive was the widespread perception of political corruption. Simply put, many Bald Knobbers believed that Taney County's local government was hopelessly corrupt, having been controlled since the 1870s by a clique of Democratic officials, like longtime office holders like Sheriff John Mosley and the county clerk Thomas Layton and the county prosecutor T.C. Spellings. And this perception was based in large part on the county's high level of bonded indebtedness, which by the early 1880s had risen to the then unprecedented figure, hold on to your hats, $42,000. Sounds like nothing today, right? I barely paid the sidewalk for that. But at that time, that was a lot of money. And in fact, there was a noticeable lack of public works projects or new schools or anything in particular that would justify that level of expense. Now, there was a courthouse fire in 1885 that destroyed a lot of the documents connected to the finances of local government, so we're not really sure exactly what happened, but certainly a lot of money went missing. And so the Bald Knobbers, the people who founded the Bald Knobber organization, were incensed at the county's debt problem, none more so than Nat Kinney, the original chieftain of the Bald Knobber organization, who professed being shocked when he discovered that, quote, the county was $42,000 in debt and had not even a plank to show for it. The money had simply been stolen. And again, that was one of the widespread perceptions that caused this group to organize in order to drive out the corrupt officials who had been holding power for so long. The third motive was a concern for economic development. As we shall see, most of the Taney County Bald Knobbers were middle or upper class men. Indeed, some of them, people like J.J. Brown, James K. Polk McCaffey, A.C. Kissy, Alonzo Prather, were among the wealthiest men in the county. And they were already heavily invested in the future of Taney County in the form of land that they had purchased and businesses that they had started there. Many of them were not native Taney Countians. They had come from other parts of the state, and they had chosen to settle there and invest their time, their effort, and their resources. They were people like the businessman Joseph Calvin, or he was typically referred to as just Cal Parrish, who helped found the first bank in Taney County. There were others who tried to introduce new forms of commerce to the area, like cotton agriculture or lead and zinc mining, and so on. So in their minds, the minds of these men who had invested so much in this area, crime and political corruption were a direct threat to their own interests, a direct threat to their livelihood, because these problems helped to hold back immigration and investment that might otherwise come to the county. At least that was the perception. So the idea is we need to do something about this, because otherwise all of the work and all of the money, all of the time and effort that we've put into developing this area will be for naught. So that's the motives of your Taney County Bald Knobbers. What about the Christian Douglas County Bald Knobbers? By contrast, the Christian Douglas County Bald Knobbers were actuated by very different motives from their brethren in Taney County. For one thing, from their activities, it appears that they were much more interested in moral issues. They put an emphasis on what I would call moral regulation, the enforcement of their own brand of morality or social mores on their neighbors. And this brings us to an interesting point of comparison. In Taney County, the first recorded acts of vigilante justice, the attempted lynching of Newton Harrell and the successful lynching of Franklin Tubal Taylor, were both in response to violent crimes committed by these individuals. By contrast, most of the early actions of the Christian County Bald Knobbers, such as raids on the saloons in Chadwick, were targeted at people who had violated the community standards of morality and decent behavior. In addition to the purveyors of drinking and gambling establishments, the Bald Knobbers in the two northern counties also punished those who violated community standards by beating their wives, abusing and neglecting their children, engaging in lewd or lascivious behavior, and so on. I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, they twice beat a local man named Green Walker, who had achieved local notoriety for living in a polygamous relationship with more than one woman. Similarly, they whipped a local homesteader by the name of E.P. Helms for keeping quote-unquote lewd women in his home. And they inflicted a similar punishment on a fellow named Horace Johnson, a shiftless local man described as being, quote, too lazy to support his family. As a result, he was taken from his home at night and beat on the back, legs, and body with sticks and large switches. So there's moral regulation. That's one of their major motives. But enforcing morality was not the only concern of your Christian Douglas County Bald Knobbers. Economic motives were also important to them. But whereas the Taney County Bald Knobbers were more concerned with the economic development of their communities, the The Christian and Douglas County Bald Knobbers were mainly focused on protecting their livelihoods and those of their families. For example, at this time, many of the vigilantes earned money through an activity called tie hacking, or the cutting of railroad ties for the railroads running through that area, particularly the old St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad, known as the Frisco Railroad. Many of the farmers and stock keepers in this area, regular times of the year, they would devote so many months of the year to cutting down and doing these railroad ties, which would help supplement their income. And many of the people engaged in this activity were bald knobbers. For this reason, they sometimes clashed with officials from local timber companies who, in their view, were treating their members unfairly. On at least 2 occasions, for example, they attempted to coerce company representatives from a local timber company based in Springfield, Missouri, into giving them more favorable prices for their ties and not culling or rejecting so many substandard ties. This emphasis on economic protection also helps explain why so many of your Christian and Douglas County bald knobbers became involved in homesteader intimidation cases. From 1887 through 1888, dozens of bald knobbers, about 3 dozen in all, bald knobbers from Christian and Douglas counties, stood trial in federal court for intimidating homesteaders and running them off their land. They did so because they felt homesteaders were crowding them off of land that they had used for years, especially for timber cutting or tie hacking purposes. Still another question that people sometimes raise, particularly after they've heard me make the distinction between the 2 types of bald knobber groups, is how these 2 organizations were similar to one another as well as how they differed. Well, one obvious point of comparison is their motives, which we've already talked about at length, so we've covered that. Another important point of comparison concerns their membership. And here there were significant differences. For example, they differed substantially by age and geographical origin. The Taney County bald knobbers came from diverse geographical backgrounds. Only about 1/2 of them listed either Missouri or Tennessee as their birthplace. 3/10 of them listed Missouri, while the rest came from different parts of the country, including Virginia, West Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, some northern states like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, New York, Massachusetts, Kansas. One, a fellow by the name of John T. Dickinson, had even immigrated from as far away as England. They were also predominantly older or middle-aged men. They averaged nearly around 40 years in age. Your Christian and Douglas County bald knobbers, by contrast, tended to be younger. They averaged around 30 years in age, with many members in their teens or 20s. As a result, nearly 6/10 of them were born in Missouri. While Missouri at that time, if you were older, you were much more likely to have come from out of state, whereas if you were younger, you were much more likely to have been born in state, because Missouri was a relatively recently settled area. So 6/10 of them were born in Missouri, while most of the rest came from the neighboring states of Tennessee, Arkansas, and Illinois, with a smattering from other states. They also differed significantly in terms of their economic backgrounds and their occupations. In general, the Taney County bald knobbers tended to attract wealthier, more socially prominent people into their ranks. Several of your Taney County bald knobbers were major landowners, like A.C. Kissy and James K. Polk McCaffey. Others, like Charles Groom or J.J. Brown, were successful attorneys. Still others, like James Parnell and Cal Parrish, were prosperous businessmen. And several of them held public office in the 1880s and the 1890s. The men who formed the Christian and Douglas County bald knobbers, by contrast, tended to be poorer, less socially prominent individuals. Few, if any of them, held public office, and approximately 9/10 of them engaged in agriculture as their sole or their primary profession, compared to only about half in Taney County. Now, despite these differences, the two groups did share at least one important demographic trait in common, and that is military service. Amongst those who were old enough to have served during the Civil War, Union veterans were much more common than Confederate veterans. The Taney County Vigilantes are at least 12 Union veterans compared to 3 Confederate veterans. The Christian Douglas County Bald Knobbers are at least 12 Union veterans compared to 2 Confederates. And also, we know that their military service was very important to them. Emotionally, it was an important part of their history, their identity, of who they were. And we know this because many of the leading Bald Knobbers, including people like Nat Kinney and David Walker, participated in Union veterans organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic, sort of a forerunner of the VFW of today. So they're pretty similar in terms of military service. Another area where they're pretty similar is their methods. Both groups used typical vigilante tactics like whipping, night riding, and intimidation to force others to do what they wanted them to do. Both of them engaged in a process called warning out. Now, this was a time-honored method of eviction that involved going to a transgressor's home in the dead of night, calling him out of his residence and informing him in the strongest language possible that you have so many days and nights to leave the area or we will pay you a return visit. And it was usually left implied what they would do in that return visit. But just in case anybody didn't understand, they would often leave a bundle of, let me go back real quick. No, that's forward. They'd leave a bundle of hickory switches. The number of switches would correspond to the number of days that you would have to vacate the area before the Bald Knobbers would pay you a return visit. So this was warning out. Probably the most striking difference was in the costume or attire of the two groups. There we go. The Taney County Bald Knobbers had no specific costume or disguise to protect their identities. They didn't really need to, because for the most part, the local government, including local law enforcement, was on their side. 4 consecutive sheriffs in Taney County belonged to the Bald Knobber organization, beginning with James K. Polk McCaffrey. So when you have the local government and local law enforcement on your side, it doesn't really matter if people know who you are. The only identifying insignia that they used was a small badge made of red silk. Descriptions at the time said it was approximately 5 by 2 inches, and it had the word "Stand Up for Taney County" and "Law and Order" stitched on it. That was pretty much it. Some of them wore that, some of them didn't. Your Christian Douglas County Bald Knobbers were not as politically influential in their communities, so they did feel the need to disguise their identities, and consequently they adopted the practice of using these elaborate and terrifying masks, one of which I have pictured here. These masks were typically, according to descriptions of them at the time, they're typically made of black cambric or calico material, which covered the whole head and face with holes cut in the fabric for the eyes and the mouth. Usually they stitched around the eye and the mouth holes with red thread, creating kind of a buttonhole appearance. And to top the impression off, they would have these cloth horns sticking out from the top of the mask, often decorated with tassels, and they'd be held aloft with plugs made from cork or wood. designed to give them a very frightening, indeed a devilish appearance. One contemporary writer said that the masks were designed to give them forms like men but faces like devils. And ding ding, that's where I got the title. Finally, the last question I often get asked about the Bald Knobbers is, how did these vigilante organizations come to an end? We know what motives actuated them. We know more or less what they did, but why did they stop? What happened to bring these organizations to an end? Well, the short answer is that in both cases they ended badly. Ended badly both for the vigilantes and for other people in their communities. In Taney County, for example, the beginning of the end probably came on the evening of February 28, 1886, when the Bald Knobber chieftain, the leader of the Taney County Bald Knobbers, Nat Kinney, shot and killed a young man by the name of Andrew Cogburn outside of an evening church service held at the Oak Grove Schoolhouse located near Kirbyville, Missouri. The Kinney-Cogburn shooting provoked an anti-vigilante backlash among certain segments of the population, led by some county leaders, particularly some people from the old Democratic courthouse ring that had just been evicted from office. They began organizing an anti-Bald Knobber militia company to oppose the vigilantes with armed force if necessary. And in part to forestall this troubling scenario, where you have Taney County basically dividing into opposing armed camps, the governor at that time, John S. Marmaduke, sent his adjutant general, James C. Jameson, to Taney County in early April of that year. And Jameson basically met with both sides, and he made it clear to them that if they weren't able to work out their differences, the state would intervene, and the state would intervene with force if necessary, and it would make the county pay the bill. So he secured from both sides a promise to disband their organizations and lay down their arms. And as a result, an uneasy truce occurred, but it lasted scarcely a month before one of the Bald Knobber leaders, George Washington Middleton, he was often known as, referred to as Wash Middleton, he shot and killed a person of the anti-Bald Knobber persuasion, a guy by the name of Samuel Snap, who, by the way, had witnessed the Cogburn shooting. He shot him outside of a general store in Kirbyville. Unlike Nat Kinney, who never faced any prosecution for shooting Cogburn, Wash Middleton was prosecuted for the murder of Samuel Snap. A local jury did convict him and sentenced him to 40 years in prison. Middleton, however, managed to escape from the county jail in Forsyth before he could be sent to the state penitentiary, and he fled into Arkansas, where he remained at large for nearly 2 years before a private detective finally tracked him down at an Independence Day picnic in Newton County, Arkansas, and shot him dead. In the meantime, violence in Taney County flared up again when anti-Bald Knobber Billy Miles gunned down Nat Kinney, the guy pictured, big strapping gentleman picture on the left there, inside the Berry Brothers store in Forsyth. While awaiting his trial for killing Kinney, Billy Miles got out on bail. On July 4th, 1889, while he's out on bail, he and his brother James Miles attended an Independence Day picnic near Kirbyville. During the festivities, Sheriff Galba Branson, a Bald Knobber, and another fellow named from out of state named Edward Funk, whom the Bald Knobbers had allegedly hired to help avenge their fallen leader, they confronted the Miles brothers. We're not sure exactly what happened, but we do know a gunfight ensued in which the Miles brothers shot and killed both Branson and Funk, who thankfully became the last two fatalities associated with the Bald Knobber troubles of that period. The Bald Knobbers in Christian and Douglas counties came to a more abrupt and no less bloody end after the organization became embroiled in a number of highly publicized and controversial court cases following the death of William Edens and his brother-in-law Charles Green on March 11, 1887. William Edens was a young local man who had gained notoriety for criticizing and speaking against the Bald Knobbers in Christian County publicly. And as a result, they had pledged to punish him in some way, and so they went looking for him at his house, and then when they didn't find him, to make a long story short, they went to his father's house, where it happened that he was staying that night along with his sister and his brother-in-law, Charles Green, and they stormed into the house, and somebody started shooting, and in the melee, Edens and Green died at the hands of a group of about 25 Bald Knobbers. Following this tragedy, a legal crackdown ensued in which Christian County authorities brought charges against roughly 80 vigilantes for various crimes. There were 25 of them arrested in connection with the Edens-Green killings, but about 80 of them arrested in all for various crimes connected to different instances of night riding, intimidation, whipping, and so on. The circuit court convicted several participants in the Edens-Green killings of murder. A number of them were given prison sentences of varying lengths. 4 of them were sentenced to death, including John Matthews, his nephew Wiley Matthews, Dave Walker, and his son William Walker, who was only 18 years old at the time. Wiley Matthews managed to escape from jail, and he was never recaptured. Rumor has it that he made his way all the way out to Oklahoma, where he lived out the remainder of his life under an assumed name and assumed identity, and he was never recaptured or made to pay for his crimes. The other 3 men, pictured here on this slide, were hung in the town of Ozark on May 10, 1889. There's actually a monument in Ozark that was erected a few years ago commemorating that event on roughly the site where they were executed. Federal authorities also participated in the crackdown on the Christian and Douglas County Bald Knobbers by launching a variety of inquests and ultimately prosecutions of various Bald Knobbers implicated in homesteader intimidation cases. Remember, I said, one of the things that a lot of the Bald Knobbers got in trouble for was driving homesteaders off of their land. Well, that's a federal crime under the provision of the 1862 Homesteader Act. And so the federal authorities also became involved in this anti-Bald Knobber legal backlash. And as a result of these proceedings, the Bald Knobber chapters in Christian and Douglas counties soon dissolved. So that's what brings them to an end. That is all I have for you this evening. My last slide is just a picture of my book. I was going to mention, for those of you who are interested in procuring a copy, I'm selling them at the low discounted price of $29, which is what I get them for as an author. And I have a half dozen available for anybody who might wish to purchase them. Thank you all. I'll take them. Thank you.